知りたいのです。愛してるを知りたいのです。Life is a journey.
Many people have found themselves deeply moved by the hit anime series that aired on Netflix, Violet Evergarden, the story of the titular character who was a former child soldier trying to fit into society after the war was over and learning how to empathize with other people through her ghostwriting career as an auto-memories doll. She has managed to have many achievements in her career, and as a character, fans have noticed particular quips and quirks and traits about her that they can compare with to people who are diagnosed with autism.
Violet Evergarden. This is another character who I actually found that I identified with a lot. I could relate to her. She definitely has a lot of autistic-like characteristics. I definitely pinpointed points where I was like, okay, I can definitely see signs of autism here. For one thing, is that she takes language extremely literally. Has a very literal and black and white way of thinking, which is often the case for those on the autistic spectrum. And like she thinks in a very sort of logical way. On top of this, she struggles to understand other people's emotions and understand her own emotions as well. She also clearly struggles to pick up social cues the majority of people take for granted. Another sign of autism.
Violet doesn't pick up on the nuances of what the client is asking. So instead she writes a straightforward and a pretty rude letter. Another time she restrained a customer in a headlock because he refused to pay for a letter that he thought was unsatisfactory. This would be the most extreme form of inappropriate behavior Violet would exhibit. With all of this going on, despite the lack of confirmation from the creators, it's not hard to see why some fans, like Devin Buchanan, would see Violet as an autistic coded character. Before I go for more analysis, I'll just like to clarify that I myself am not on the spectrum, but I do understand why so many fans, especially autistic fans, see Violet as someone who's possibly on the spectrum. I'm not here to say that this view is wrong or right. If it makes it easier for someone to feel more connected to a character by thinking this way, I think that's just peachy. So generally, it's an unspoken rule when someone is crying, you comfort them. According to Buchanan's article on the Anime Feminist, Violet's matter-of-fact response to this lady seems to indicate that she's not aware of this unspoken rule. Furthermore, Violet doesn't seem to be aware that she's being rude until she realizes the clients are complaining about her. Buchanan notes that this sort of misunderstanding is super commonplace for people with autism, especially at work, and it leads them to be alienated, like Violet in this situation. To the customers, Violet's neurodiversity is perceived as coldness, and this definitely causes friction between the customers and some of the staff. Luckily, most of Violet's co-workers realize that she's not purposely being rude. It's just that she's a little different and just doesn't really understand some things sometimes. Violet's just a misunderstood outcast. And instead of shunning her away for not understanding something, I'm so glad this anime shows that just by explaining things a little more, it works a lot better.
So, one of the most frequently discussed topics in the Violet Evergarden fanbase is the potentiality of Violet Evergarden being autistic. There are a lot of people who are quite excited about this prospect because that would lead to more representation of people with disabilities. However, it's stated quite clearly in the show that many of her traits stem from the fact that she suffers from PTSD. So, this video exists to ask the question and thoroughly examine it. Is Violet Evergarden autistic? Before we delve deeper into the topic, it should be fair to define what autism is. Autism is described as follows: a developmental disorder of variable severity that is characterized by difficulty in social interaction and communication and by restricted or repetitive patterns of thought and behavior. Note the importance of the description of variable severity, because autism is described as a spectrum.
We know that anyone can, be on the spectrum.
It comes in various types. There can be mild types of autism and more severe types of autism, which can affect severely the way people can learn or even speak and even walk at times, depending on how severe the autism may be.
All the little things that everyone does unconsciously, autistic people do manually, so that adds up. What I'm doing with every part of my body I am to some degree aware of and trying to do.
I myself am mildly autistic, so this video is going to be somewhat personal. However, for the sake of thoroughly discussing this topic, I have considered other alternatives, and I want to discuss it with you, just to see if the titular character of Violet Evergarden really is, as many people have theorized, autistic. Before we thoroughly examine Violet Evergarden's character, I should probably notify some terms about autism. With autistic people, they usually have a very different way of processing information. People with autism usually have heightened senses. Something to note about people who are autistic is that they process and learn information at a different rate compared to other people. It's typically more slowly, but that's mainly because autistic people want more detail as to how things work. They want to make proper sense of the world. It's not a simple case of one brief description. People with autism will usually want a very thorough description for certain tasks and objects and basically things to make sense of how the world works. And people with autism usually have heightened physical senses. People with autism also tend to be really talented in one area, but also seem to struggle in another area. Of course, people with autism are largely known for struggling with social interaction.
It takes a lot of effort to appear like the way I do right now. Like, it takes a lot of conscious awareness. Social skills are like a muscle for us.
People will often say to me, "Oh, you're so high functioning, I would never know you had autism unless you said something." And I say, well, you don't live inside my skin, and you don't know how hard it is for me sometimes just to get through a day.
It's very, very draining. Even with people that I care for or enjoy being around, I have to psych myself up to be around them.
People with autism can be too disruptive and loud in some areas, but completely ignoring people in other moments. People with autism tend to find comfort in repetitive patterns and routines. They want things to be orderly, which is why autistic people tend to be fairly precise in what they do, and is the main reason why autistic people get quite upset whenever a routine is disrupted in some way. These signs of autism can be very apparent at a young age, yet most autistic people will learn how to fit in with society better while still carrying out some of their traits as they grow older. But also note that talking about autism isn't always straightforward to define, because autism is a spectrum and there are other conditions that could define people, such as Asperger's syndrome or PTSD or Alexithymia, which we'll discuss later on in this video. So, now that we've thoroughly described what autism is, let's delve into the show of Violet Evergarden and see if the titular character is indeed autistic. Something worth noting is that the entire narrative of Violet Evergarden is how Violet manages to understand how to empathize with other people and how she is able to convey their true feelings in the form of letters for her clients. As we as an audience are introduced to Violet Evergarden as a character, a few certain traits stand out already. Firstly, people will notice that, even in the presence of others, Violet usually has a mostly expressionless face. Other characters around her describe Violet Evergarden as resembling a doll, very fitting given her career as a ghostwriter called an Auto-Memories doll.
It can be so overwhelming, so intense that in order to function, you kind of have to sort of be still or shut down a bit.
We can't filter them out because we feel them so strongly, so we shut down as a way of processing all those emotions.
Another thing that will stand out about Violet Evergarden as a character is the fact that she speaks in a very straightforward, factual manner. And, much like Drax from Guardians of the Galaxy, metaphors go right over Violet's head. Although, nothing really goes past Violet's head, right? Her reflexes are too fast. If something goes past her, she'll catch it, right? As the show continues, we as an audience notice other traits about Violet Evergarden. I'd like to give credit to this Tumblr website page that I found that made a fairly accurate list of some of Violet's traits throughout the first 4 episodes of the show, which I'd like to describe to you now. Yeah, I know that sites like Reddit and Tumblr are not the utmost reliable sources, but hey, I was trying to understand the fan base's say on this topic before briefly reading a few scholarly papers about the topic of autism, so I tried my best, okay? So anyway, in the first 4 episodes of the Violet Evergarden series, we as an audience noticed the following traits about her. For those who are catching on, it's made apparent right away that Violet Evergarden doesn't catch on to subtle emotional signs about people. It's very clear right from the first episode that Claudia Hodgins knows something that Violet Evergarden doesn't. And as a result, because Violet Evergarden takes everything very literally, she takes what Claudia Hodgins says to her at face value. This not only works for an analysis of Violet being autistic, but this is a purposeful characteristic that's meant to be something that she'll grow from throughout the show. There are more visible signs of Violet potentially being autistic, such as being unsettled after a routine disruption. This is showcased in the first episode when Claudia was about to leave Violet in the Evergarden household, only for Violet to come out, expressing that she wouldn't know what to do without the Major's orders. She also has this habit of mouthing objects, such as the toy puppy that she chooses to have as a reminder of her past time, as well as mouthing this precious emerald brooch of hers, which reminds her of Major Gilbert's eyes. Major Gilbert was Violet's previous caretaker. From this act of mouthing objects, it's made apparent that Violet is a fairly sensitive person in the physical sense, in that she wants to make sense of her objects in an intimate sort of way. And mouthing objects is her way of being quite close to some precious objects. We also see that Violet is perceptive and bluntly honest, as showcased in the scene where, being adopted by Tiffany Evergarden, Violet bluntly says, "I can't replace your lost child." It's very brutal, but Violet Evergarden is a character whom, by her own words, says that she cannot tell a lie. That's another interesting habit about autistic people. They usually make for terrible liars. Violet Evergarden also frequently shows a lack of physical boundaries. This is showcased in a rather comedic way when Violet is told to undress, and she almost completely undresses her top half in front of Benedict, one of the employees at the postal service. What I find interesting about the humor of Violet Evergarden's character, looking back at the show, is that the humor is never played in a way that degrades her character. The humor is played in a way that, well, Violet's characteristics are unusual. And you can sense that she's still trying her best. So these traits come across as rather charming in the fact that she's rather innocent in the things that she's doing, which is why those scenes are quite funny. Another trait of Violet Evergarden is that she focuses on tasks to the point of neglecting other needs, such as sleep and eating. This is showcased in the first episode in the way that she works all the way throughout the day and all the way into the night through organizing letters and then delivering them respectively. She had to be encouraged by her current caretaker, Claudia Hodgins, to take a break and eat. The first episode was centered on Violet just beginning to get into society and being introduced to the postal service. The second episode is centered on Violet being introduced to what an Otto Memories doll ghostwriter is. Through her initial learning of what this ghostwriting job involves, Violet showcases her social struggles. Violet showcases her difficulties with social interaction with multiple clients here. We see that Violet is oblivious to how she types, and she has this habit of typing a bit too loudly. I can particularly relate to being a bit too loud, because believe it or not, the way I'm talking to you just now, even though I am somewhat projecting, this is actually my normal speaking voice. I'm not trying to raise my voice. This is actually just the way I speak. I've been gifted with a naturally theatrical voice. However, in close social interaction, this can be quite bothersome for some people, which is why one person in my family in particularly keeps telling me to quiet down. It never ceases to frustrate me to be constantly told to keep myself quiet, but I respect them and just keep the voice down as much as it irritates me nevertheless. We also see in the show that Violet is frequently oblivious to other people's feelings. Something to note about people with autism is that as much as they've been gifted to be highly practical thinkers, they are not very skilled in the ways of social nuances, which is something they either have to continue to somehow live with or somehow learn to adapt to. And we see once again here, Violet shows no understanding of physical boundaries, as shown by her restraining an angry client. She also shows no understanding of how words communicate indirect meaning, as showcased with her hilariously bad letter made for a client who was trying to take a man out for a date. Many people might say that the first half, or at least the first 3 or so episodes, or maybe even the first 2 episodes of Violet Evergarden are a bit too slow, and the real astonishing presentation of Violet Evergarden doesn't really happen until the second half. However, the first half is really important in establishing the setting and using its slow pacing for us to showcase Violet Evergarden as a character. This series as a whole is first off primarily about this character's development as the series goes along. Each and every episode contributes to her growth in some way or another, no matter how small, which is why the first few episodes, as slow as they may be, are really important to establishing Violet's social struggles, and by episode 3, we begin to see how Violet will overcome these struggles in order to learn how to empathize with society.